Good morning, everybody. My name is Jacek Saryusz-Wolski. I'm chairing this session. Welcome. We have no time in Europe. Some say we have 5 days to save or to lose Europe. So we have no time as a session, and straightforward we go to the main speaker, and then we'll move to the panel debate. But the main speaker and a key person is Mario Monti, academic and politician, former commissioner, a figure which makes an impact on the course of events in Europe, especially in economic domain, irrespective of which function he has at the moment. So, Mario Monti, thanks for coming, thanks for being with us, and you have the floor. Please enlighten us about past and future of the European economy and Eurozone in particular. You have the floor. You may speak from here or from the rostrum, whatever you prefer.
From here. Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Thank you also for giving me that very circumscribed remit for my remarks. I'm very honored and genuinely extremely pleased to be here in Poland for this very important conference. I wish to thank President Belka in particular and more generally the Polish presidency. To be introduced by you, Mr. Chairman, reminds me of my early days as a European Commissioner, when I played my role being Internal Market, Financial Services and Taxation Commissioner in the huge preparatory efforts of Poland, among others, for accession. And everybody was particularly in the Commission preparing their files very, very well on the Polish case, not so much because of the clear, great importance of Poland, but because we all knew that the interlocutor on the other side of the table was a particularly strong, active, and demanding personality. So it was at that time that I first came to meet you. I wish to underline how fortunate the title of this conference is, because it contains several words, but it contains in particular one word which is not often mentioned in Europe these days, although it was at the very origin of the whole European enterprise, and that is integration. What this conference calls for is towards a more integrated and stable Europe. And this, I think, goes very, very much at the core of what I understand to be the Polish vision of the European process. If we take the very first item in the priorities that guided the Polish presidency, if I remember well, that first priority is formulated as follows: growth through integration, which is just about one of the very, very rare avenues that Europe now has in order to pursue growth through more integration. And I think that this is a time where the calendar has been very helpful to us in offering us the Polish presidency, because Europe needs the intellectual and political leadership of Poland in these issues. I remember when I visited Poland several times last year for consultations, when I was preparing a report on the future of the single market for President Barroso, I detected here in Poland an attitude vis-à-vis that topic which was not usually found in many other member states. And I even had a small image that I understand had a little role in subsequently driving the work of the Polish presidency. I said to them, well, unfortunately, Poland will never be able to say that it was a founding member of the European Union, because history did not put it in Rome in 1957. But with this insistence today on redeveloping, deepening, extending, taking more seriously the single market, that is the combination of market, of openness, and of integration, and of competition, Poland can perhaps one day say that it has been a refounding member of the European Union, because these attitudes, the interest for these key aspects of economic and social life has, as we all know, faded away quite significantly in the last 10 or 15 years from the very founding members that had been the engines of European integration for a long time. This session is entitled "The History and Prospects of the EMU Beyond Economics." I will work particularly on the beyond economics aspect, and if you allow me, on the very first letter of EMU, which is there almost as a little decoration normally, but often neglected. EMU meaning Economic and Monetary Union, all the developments, all the attention, all the political excitement, all the more or less sexy aspects have been identified for many years now in the in the monetary union, in the single currency. And I'm not sure that member states of the Eurozone often realize to what a large extent many of them are not really member of an economic union, and in some cases they actually couldn't care less. Although as years go by, it turns out that many of the problems that the Eurozone now has indeed have to do with the fact that the economic aspect of EMU was not taken seriously enough. And by economic aspect of EMU, I certainly do not mean just the economic governance. Let's take a very, very important document, the task force report presented by President Van Rompuy about 1 year ago, which was the fundamental basis for the six-pack agreement. Huge, badly needed progress in the economic governance of the Eurozone. But if you take one sentence in the introduction to that report, you see now the economic pillar of Economic and Monetary Union is finally in place. No, I'm sorry, that is not enough, because the economic pillar of EMU, to my understanding, consists of two components. One is, for sure, a better governance of the non-monetary policies, and that is what has come with the six-pack. But the other one is even more fundamental, and that is economic union, the structural aspect of integration under the real aspects, not monetary, among the member states. And that boils down fundamentally to the single market. And we often discover that the countries belonging to the EU, but not to the Eurozone, have a much deeper understanding, higher cultural and political acceptance, and a higher daily practice of being an economic union, of respecting the single market, openness, competition, and so on, than have many of the member states of the Eurozone. So it is as if within the EU, implicitly a division of labor had taken place, with some guys specializing in what they love most, that is, making a monetary union among themselves, and others not willing or not able for the time being to be part of the euro, have specialized in taking integration very seriously from the point of view of markets and competition. And I say this having in mind one consideration pertaining to the past and one pertaining to the future. The one pertaining to the past is that we shouldn't be so surprised if the growth rate on average in the Eurozone, quite apart from these 2 years of crisis, has been less satisfactory than the growth rate outside the Eurozone. That is because the Eurozone countries have accepted a smaller degree of economic integration among themselves and have become more closed. Who created the problems concerning the Services Directive, a topic to which Poland is not insensitive at all, and its billions of plumbers equally are not insensitive, especially in France. Well, it was France and Germany and others that created problems to the Services Directive. Who created problems to the Takeover Directive, which tried to achieve for CEOs and for controlling structures of corporations the same degree of openness and integration that the Service Directive tried to achieve for plumbers. Well, CEOs, always very much in favor of European integration, went with alarms to their respective governments to ask to moderate the flame for integration of the European Commission, and in fact we had a takeover directive which was very, very modest and full of holes, more than if Mr. Hildebrand is no longer here with us, more full of holes than a Swiss cheese. And the aspect pertaining to the future that I'd like to single out when it comes to the different attitude vis-à-vis the markets of the Eurozone and the non-Eurozone members has to do, of course, with the Euro Plus Pact and with the eventual modification of the treaty to have even stronger weapons for discipline within the Eurozone, and the issue whether that treaty should embrace 27 or 17 member states. That is not an irrelevant issue, and I will say one word about it in a moment when I consider the divisiveness that has been brought about in Europe by the Eurozone crisis, that according to me, and in the spirit of the beyond economics connotation of this session, is the most serious consequence of the Eurozone crisis. So, on the Eurozone crisis, let me stress once again what President Trichet explained to us in a crystal clear way yesterday, namely that we should not fall in the semantic trap of calling this the euro crisis. There is no element of crisis whatsoever discernible, at least so far, concerning the euro, a currency that has not been losing either domestic or external purchasing power, in spite of the earthquakes occurring within several of its member states in terms of fiscal and banking crisis. So this is definitely a huge crisis of several economies in the Eurozone, but by no means a crisis of the Euro. And as again President Trichet underlined, the aggregate, the consolidated size of this fiscal plus banking crisis for the Eurozone is smaller than it is for the US, the UK, Japan, except that unlike them, we are neither a state like the UK or Japan, nor a federal state like the US. So we have important weaknesses in the governance, not so much of the sheer size of these imbalances, but of their distribution within the zone, their asymmetries. And it is this the problem that has come up as the most critical. On the Eurozone crisis, if I am allowed by President Belka, I would like to quote two little sentences that he had yesterday in his concluding remarks, which I happen to share entirely. One is, we are at a critical juncture, critical but not fatal. Although, of course, history will tell us exposed, but this is my firm belief as well as yours, Marek. And also, apparently in contradiction with the first sentence, there will not be a quick fix solution. Why there will not be a quick fix solution? Because irrespective of how magic the touch of the leaders on Sunday plus Wednesday might be, and there is no strong lead indication so far that they will be this time at the highest point of their magic qualities. But even if they are marvelous, as certainly they are in terms of intentions, it will take a much, much longer time, in my view, to cure the biggest disease coming out from this Eurozone crisis, which I consider to be the divisiveness among Europeans. Many of you will remember a short article written in 1997 by Martin Feldstein in Foreign Affairs, entitled The Single Currency and International Conflict. I remember reading that article at the time, and full of respect for Professor Feldstein, nevertheless, I thought that article was simply crazy, because it said, okay, like most high-level American economic minds, that most likely the euro would never have seen the day, but if ever it had seen the day, although it was conceived in order to unite even more deeply Europeans, it may well be the case that it would divide Europeans. I thought it was divide Europeans, of course, or perhaps not to the extent of recreating tensions, bringing to wars. So the article was not a humoristic article, but pointing them against each other. I thought this was a nightmare once experienced by Martin Feldstein. I thought this until the spring of 2010, when I saw, as we all did, the front pages of the magazines in Germany referring rather impolitely to Greece. And when we saw in those very weeks, in the first street manifestations in Athens and other Greek cities, the swastika reappearing as a symbol. And a few weeks later, we saw, or at least we knew of, huge divisions of minds between the French president and the German chancellor, and a sudden burst of mistrust in the intimacy of this very couple leading Europe. Not much time after that, we saw a big coming back to stereotypes, or at least I consider that they are stereotypes, but we are beyond economics here, between the virtuous north of Europe and I can't find an adjective bad enough to qualify the south. And more recently, even within the poor guys of the south, we had a pronouncement by the Spanish finance minister saying to Italy and to Greece, wait a moment, or rather hurry up, because you are deteriorating day by day the segment of the financial market for us, collectively the poor guys of Europe at this time. And partly generated by the Euro crisis and the Greek crisis, the Eurozone crisis and the Greek crisis, you see the emergence of true Finns. But also, I must say, the emergence of many more true Europeans than I believed were still alive. So all this points to huge divisions, but this is the psychological re-emerging antagonism, which of course is exactly the opposite of what we hoped European integration would bring us to. But this also risks being embodied for the long term into new institutional divisions. And here is the point of the possible new treaty meant for the further reinforcement of the Eurozone, and lawyers are still discussing whether such a treaty would need 27 signatures or 17 signatures. And I would simply like here to convey a concern that I have, which derives from what I said earlier about some people feeling more at ease with the M and others more at ease with the E. I personally have nothing against a Europe of two speeds. That has been an arrangement that has helped us bring about Schengen, the monetary union, and so on. But I would be more concerned about a Europe of two speeds where each of the two were convinced that he and the others close to him are in the first speed. Which could well be the case if we have a further deepening of the integrated governance of the Eurozone, which is probably needed for the Eurozone to be really stable, which may, however, composed as it would be by the continental countries of Europe, basically, of course, plus Ireland, but with a strong Franco-German lead. Well, that would be a leadership that, with the exception of Germany in recent years, after it has regained confidence in the competitiveness of its economy, but if we take the last 15 years as a whole, that would be a leadership with a strong risk of creating a really well-integrated but corporatist Europe within the Eurozone, with not much of a fight against rent seekers, not much commitment for competition and openness, and probably not overall a strong prospect for global competitiveness. But, of course, they would feel to be the first class, the highest speed, because they would proceed quicker and in a more stable way towards the monetary and governance and maybe political integration. On the other side would be the other 10, assuming that we are 17 and 27, the other 10 who would feel, of course, not interested in the single currency, except countries like, I presume, Poland, which do see the single currency as a perspective, even though as a less hotly desired perspective than it would have been until a couple of years ago. But these countries, because of their culture, and I refer to the UK, Denmark, Sweden, and many of the new member states, are more keen on competition, market, competitiveness, openness, and all that. And on this point, the last remark I would like to make is, if it were to be the case, as some lawyers say, that at any rate the 17 of the Eurozone to put in place a new treaty for themselves would need to have 27 signatures, the topic would then be what would be the attitude, in particular, of Great Britain, from where, through occasional fogs, we hear these days the welcome, slightly extraterritorially, extraterrestrial even sounding voice of Prime Minister Cameron urging us to do well and quickly on the euro, which is a nice aspect of, after all, solidarity, I should say, in this country. But the problem would be if the signature of the UK is necessary, signature plus ratification, what concessions would the UK ask for? And there I heard one likely course of action, that is, the UK might give its assent to this treaty, provided there is some dilution of some financial services regulation that the City of London believes has gone a bit too far in Brussels in recent years. In my view, if this were to be accepted by the Eurozone member states, this would be a bit of an undoing what has been done. But on the other hand, I would love to see, and I believe that here the role of Poland would be the most decisive, I would love to see a progressive solution of this negotiation, where the UK and Poland, etc., would say to the 17 in the Eurozone, okay, we are happy to let you go ahead with this treaty at one condition, not to go back on financial regulation, but to go further on the single market in all the aspects of the services market, the digital economy market, the liberalization of the professions, a common energy market worth this name, and so on and so forth. I think this would be something of benefit to the ones and to the others. I will use the very last few minutes in noting another aspect which is beyond economics, but with a huge impact of economics. And this time I'll be more centered on Germany. I think what is most damaging for Europe and for the stability of the Eurozone are the psychological cycles that we have seen to happen in the last 15 years. We are seeing an increasing degree of short-termism in policy making. Politicians in Europe very well, I believe, have tried and to some extent succeeded in eradicating excessive short-termism through some regulations from the financial markets, except that they have been contagied by this in treating this material, that is short-termism, and have become short-termist themselves even more than they used to be. Example, one can find traces of short-termism even in that little corner of policies, which is the policy of discipline. I think we can speak of two examples already of short-termism in discipline. One was in 96, 97, 98 with Minister Theo Weigel going around Europe with the standard 3,0. You will not be allowed to go 1 millimeter beyond the 3% deficit. Was that short-term? Yes, because the imperative was a short-term political imperative to persuade the German public opinion that they could accept the euro, even in the remote possibility that one day those sunny guys in the south may be on the same boat with them. But then who destroyed the Stability Pact just a few years later? It was Germany and France in 2003 with the complicity of Italy, which was chairing the Council. And then I see this new round of enhancing discipline, which is totally justified in view of the Greek and other crises, which took place with the reform of governance, as broadly welcome. But if you look at the profile that will be required in terms of going down, in terms of the debt to GDP ratio, that will probably impart a restrictive course to fiscal policies that, unless there is a strong growth coming from other sources, will probably make, once again, this arrangement for discipline to have been helpful in the short term for Mrs. Merkel to be able, with difficulties, to gain consensus of the Bundestag on the various steps necessary for Greece and others, but which will probably represent us in a few years with a problem that a pact had been stipulated which does not really meet the test in a context of lack of economic growth, which brings us to the European policies for growth, where my view is that, of course, they should come more from structural reforms. And I was fascinated by what Marek Pelka said yesterday concerning the logical reason why Lisbon was disarmed without teeth, because it was felt, because it was underestimated the damage of spillover of structural weakness from one member state to the other. Now the EU 2020 is a bit more armed in that respect. But once again, I think the attitude of Germany will be critical. And here I would like to close with another sentence that was used by David Marsh concluding the panel yesterday morning. He said that his conclusion from the panel was more Europe, more market, more discipline, more Germany. that is profoundly, I don't know whether David is still here, that
I'm listening to every word.
Okay. I thought this were profoundly, this was profoundly philosophical, as often under your light words. And there is the whole history of European integration there. Don't worry, Chairman, because in 2 minutes I will close. But more Europe, more market, more Germany. Well, I understand that in the early 70s, when there was a referendum in the UK whether or not to exit the single market, the winning argument for those saying, no, let's not exit, was the following: unless we tie our hands by sticking to Germany's vision, culture of the market, we will never put order in our messy domestic UK economy. And just a few years later, all of us did exactly the same thing in the Maastricht Treaty concerning discipline. And I remember very well one occasion, 1993, I guess, when Mrs. Thatcher, no longer Prime Minister, was in Milan for a panel. I happened to be there, and I tried to explain to her the virtues that we Italians, but I believe others as well, were attributing to the Maastricht Treaty as a constraint for public finance. And she said, oh, now I finally understand why so many Europeans are keen, and you in particular Italians are keen on the Maastricht Treaty. Now I understand, but you must understand one thing, that the British people couldn't care less about the Maastricht Treaty because they had me. And I think that tells a lot. And Europe was put in trouble almost exclusively when Germany departed either from market or from discipline. From market by introducing so many restraints alongside France in the last 10 or 15 years, not pushing integration further, and of course departed from discipline when we saw the 2003 Franco-German attack on the Stability Pact. I hope you will have appreciated the totally disorderly way in which I've tried to introduce some not purely economic considerations in this fascinating adventure of European integration, for which I repeat once again, echoing Marek, critical but not fatal, but no quick fix. Thank you very much.
Molto grazie per la sua improvvisazione italiana. Thank you. It was very enlightening. Thank you very much, Mario Monti. And now we go to the panel. Let me greet the participants. Is Anna Diamantopoulou, once upon a time Commissioner, but now Minister of Education, Lifelong Learning and Religious Affairs from Greece. And the country she comes from has nothing to do with the subject. Harold James, professor from Princeton University, but as I know, he's from Britain. Ruud Lubbers, former Prime Minister of Netherlands, and Avinash Persaud, Chairman of Intelligence Capital Limited, Professor and Senior Fellow, Caribbean Policy Research Institute. This session was meant to be non-economic or to go beyond economics, and at the same time to go beyond the short-term preoccupations which dominate so much the present debate. Even the conference on the budget, I mean the tripartite conference on the budget from which I am coming from Brussels, amazingly was not about budget but about crisis. So everything is so short-term that so let's make an attempt at least to be more long-term. Moving away from this short-term approach and from this purely economic to understand longer and wider perspectives. Looking back, it means roughly 10 years back when the euro, or 15, was conceived and born. and let's say 10, 20 years ahead of us to see the longer term, not the immediate, I mean, from this Sunday till Wednesday solutions, because we lack this wider and longer perspective. I want to ask three questions, or to indicate three areas to the panelists as chairing this session. First is looking back. The question is, were we wrong while designing Eurozone with the whole instrumentarium around it, Maastricht convergence, whatever institutional setup to control macroeconomic behavior of the member states? So was the design or the construction right? This is the question, having economic and monetary union in the name and having de facto monetary union in place. I remember a seminar in Florence, in European University Institute on EMU 20 years ago, when conceptually the EMU already, monetary and economic existed, and it was so evident that without this economic, which means political dimension, it is bound to fail. So were we wrong? What was missing in the initial phase? The second question is looking forward. There are so many answers that we are already quite fixed on them, and the question is how we'll achieve the fiscal union. What will be the next steps, or a step towards the fiscal and transfer union, and how to do it. Some elements of that were indicated by Professor Monti. And my third question is about the risk of saving core Europe and losing greater Europe, which means installing two-tier or two-class Europe, or moving into the core club policy making, leaving others outside, or even more historically, undoing reunification of the continent. And what are the answers to avoid this somehow unavoidable course of events is an answer in the theory of Jacques Delors of concentric circles, with some centrifugal dynamics, to which you, Mr. Monti, indicated, how to install the brakes on borrowers and on lenders, because the problem is on those two sides. Governments are borrowing too much and banks are lending too much, and how to accompany that with democratic legitimacy. 10, 15 years perspective ahead of us. Let's forget about the present mess we are in. So these are my questions to the panelists, and I'll move and invite all of them to speak for no more than 7 minutes. Then there will be several rounds. I'll try to invite as much as possible the audience to a debate. And we start with Anna Diamantopoulou. You have the floor.
Thank you, Chairman. I would like to thank the National Bank of Poland for this invitation. It's a very good opportunity for me to speak about these issues, and with Greece in the center of this crisis. And I really think it's a privilege for me to speak after Mario Monti, for whom I strongly believe that he is one of the fathers of Europe in our generation, because in each generation has its own fathers. A few years ago, when I was a member of the Commission with Mr. Monti, and in a crisis, we had many crises at that time, President Prodi at that time had said, "I'm sure the euro will oblige us to introduce a new set of economic policy instruments. It is politically impossible to propose that now." It was in 2001. "But someday there will be a crisis and new instruments will be created." The crisis is here. It's not a crisis of euro. I totally agree. It's a crisis of the Eurozone. It's a crisis of the way we have structured our institutions, but it is here. For years, Greece was no news for the financial papers. And it is obvious why. It is a small country and its economy is less than 2% of the European GDP. Now there is not even one day that Greece is not big news in the first page of all financial papers. And it is now in the center of this international crisis for two reasons. One is the set of problems that it faces itself. And the second one is that because of the problems that it may be creating for the European Union if there is a big problem in the country itself. Both sets of problems are due to three reasons. The first one is the responsibilities of the mismanagement of public finance in Greece. The second one is the institutional weakness of the European Union. The third one is the international crisis. So I will try to combine the questions of the chairman and what is going on in Greece. And I'll pick up some of the issues I would like to refer, and I will continue in the other rounds. What is happening now in Greece is, of course, because for 30 years we have, as I said, a mismanagement in our public finances, and we didn't take seriously the entrance in the Eurozone, and we didn't didn't fulfill our commitments. It is obvious now that the whole structure of Eurozone was not enough for several member states to follow the rules and to comply with commitments. I could was quite lax for Greeks, and they suddenly, in one night, found themselves with a very hard currency and with low interest rates. This led to an explosion of credit for all, consumers, investors, the public sectors, housing, etc. More or less, we can find the same things in Portugal or in Spain, less in Italy for different reasons, but in each country. It was a matter of time that we would have a credit and debt crisis. The crisis is very deep. And now the question is, before the question, I think that it is obvious that although we had an EMU, we don't have a common fiscal identity at the European level, because in Portugal is a crisis of the production model. In Ireland, it's a crisis of financial model. In Greece, is a crisis of both. And now we are in the situation we are now. The question is, should we pay the price for all these weaknesses? The answer is very clear. Yes, we have to pay the price. And we do it every day. There are huge reforms. There is huge cuts in almost every month during the last 18 months. I have distributed, and you can find it, some figures for which I think it's of economic and political interest. What is going on in a country which is democracy in the last 18 months? And I would like just to give you an idea. We had in 18 months the largest annual fiscal consolidation ever by a euro area economy, which reduced the general government's deficit by 5.1% in 1 year. And in the next 2 years, by the end of 2012, it will be more 4.8%. So 10% fiscal consolidation in 3 years. The primary deficit was 24 billion in 2009, and it reduced in 11.4 billion in 2010. Of course, somebody has to compare the figures with the whole GDP of the country. In order to achieve these numbers, but we talk beyond economics, you cannot imagine the number of reforms which have taken place in each field, from pensions to the administrative field, from education to the labor market, from pensions to closed occupations to everything that somebody could imagine. We decided the pension reform, the most difficult ever reform, in 15 days. And we really implemented more than 155 laws in the parliament in the 18 months. The parliament hasn't stopped, not even for a day. The reforms and the decisions in a democracy needs time and trust. The political time is totally different than the financial time. In politics, you have to explain to people, you have to design, you have to legislate, you have to implement, and then you have to have the results. And we had in 18 months to do all these things, sometimes with no time just to explain to our parliamentarian group what is going on. It is a real problem of how democracy works and how it can work, and if it can work more than taking into account where we are now. Because beyond reading the numbers, the cuts, and the reforms, there are always people. In 18 months, we have an unemployment of 18%. The recession this year will go to almost 6%. In 18 months, we have a reduction in the salaries up to 30%, a reduction in the pensions up to 30%. We have cuts in the budgets for schools, for hospitals, and for all social policies up to 30%. In my field, and I'm not a minister, an economic minister, but because of my portfolio, which is education, universities, research and technology, lifelong learning, I am in the center of the social problems. We had to proceed with reforms which have to take into account that we have 16% reduction in teachers and professors, which means 20,000 people retired, and we had to function the schools with no problems. So in 1 year to close down more than 2,000 schools in small villages and in neighborhoods. We had to proceed with huge reforms in universities. You can imagine what university reforms mean, and to close down dozens of departments, and at the same time to save the net of researchers and academic world in the country. We have to do all these things. We have not to complain. As I said in the beginning, it is obvious that it has to do with mismanagement, it has to do with the responsibilities of the political system for years, but at the same time, since we have this self-awareness and since we are in a democratic zone, I think it is important when there is all these comments or evaluation or reports about what is going on in Greece, and if we proceed well and if we do our job, I would like just to answer and say that we have done more than we could as a party, as a democratic and particularly as a social democratic party in power, but we didn't do enough. We know it very well. But because of this crisis, there is now a question of democracy and debt, sovereignty and debt. And this is part of the discussion we have to go on now at a European level. And one word, and then I will come back, about the role of, about the changes, the decisions we have to proceed at the European level. Many years ago, when the European Union has been decided, it was, I could say the slogan, make business and not war. We must not underestimate the fact that we have peace, we have prosperity at the European, in our European continent. And not only that, huge achievements in terms of democracy and in terms of solidarity. Now, it is obvious that make business and not war is not enough for a Europe of values. We criticize political leaders. We criticize Mrs. Merkel or Mr. Merkel or Mr. Sarkozy because there are delays, they are not decisive enough, the European institutions do not work as we wanted to do. But now what it is obvious? It is obvious that we call and we ask national leaders, because Mrs. Merkel is a national leader. She has been elected by Germans. Mr. Sarkozy is a national leader. We ask national leaders to solve European problems or problems of other countries and to speak and be accepted by other people who have other priorities and other kind of problems. It is obvious that we cannot combine the national interest with the European interest, and now that this is in the core, in the philosophical and political core of our decisions. We need European leadership. And I believe that, of course, we proceeded with new institutions, and we did it in an unprecedented way. Nobody could imagine that the FSF would be in the place and we would have, we had worked with new institutions beyond the treaty in these last 2 years, but maybe it is not enough. We need a different Europe. We need a more political Europe. And if we want to explain what it is, I believe that we have to answer to the question, should we have politically elected leadership at European level? My answer is yes.
Thank you, Minister. And now the floor goes to Harold James, professor from Princeton. Give the floor.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank President Belka very much for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here. For me, it's a great pleasure coming back to Poland. I first came to Poland in the middle of the 1980s, when there was still martial law. And I remember vividly talking first in a private apartment and then giving a lecture in the University of Warsaw on a theme that still seems to me to have some relevance. The lecture was later published in Economista in 1987 with the title Dlaczego trzeba polubić kryzys? Why we should learn to love a crisis. It seems to me that we obviously don't love the kind of crisis that we're in at the moment, but crises are always a learning experience, and crises, and the crisis that Poland had in the 1980s was very clearly a demonstration of many structures and many institutions and many values that had gone profoundly wrong. And crises are an opportunity to correct those. In the sense of this panel of going beyond economics and giving a broad perspective, I would like to go beyond the question of whether we're going to get a fix over this weekend or by next Wednesday, and to look back at a long history in order to think about two things. First of all, the way in which monetary union can work, and secondly, the way in which debt mechanics can work, because both of these have a really long history. For monetary union, I would like to go back to the 60s, a period of a tremendous, costly American war that divided Americans, of innovative music, a cultural revolution. I mean, I should explain as a historian, I mean the 1860s, not the 1960s. The 1860s was a period in which there was a first surge of globalization and in which the statesmen of Europe started to think about a monetary union that would expand. There was a Latin monetary union that was introduced in the early 1860s. And in 1867, Napoleon III called a conference in Paris to think of a global monetary union. It didn't come about. At the time, the leading British economist, the editor of the periodical The Economist, Walter Bagehot, a famous commentator on monetary affairs, wrote a brilliant study of why it was unlikely to come apart. He said, if you do this, you need to have a system that will do no violence to national jealousies. But everybody has these national jealousies, and they really stopped this development to a monetary union. But the idea of having some kind of common standard in a world in which there was more and more commercial interconnection was a very obvious one and a very necessary one. The second theme I wanted to deal with briefly was the question of debt, because again, this is a long, long historic issue. We've had debt crises for hundreds and hundreds of years. There's a wonderful book by Ken Rogoff and Carmen Reinhardt on the long history of debt crises. One of the striking developments, though, when you look at that long history of debt crises, is the change that took place in the late 17th and early 18th century as a consequence of the adoption in Britain of fundamentally Dutch techniques of debt management with the new monarchy that came in 1688 with William of Orange. And what was being done was to replace foreign debt with domestic debt. Foreign debt is inherently unstable. That was the main reason that the Spanish monarchy or the French monarchy had so many and so regular defaults in the 16th century and the 17th century. The Habsburgs borrowed from the moneylenders in Genoa, in Florence, in Venice, in Augsburg, and then they found it actually quite pleasurable not to pay them back, and there was a default. The consequence was that it was extremely expensive for the Spanish monarchy or the French monarchy to borrow. The Dutch and then the British innovation was to develop a domestic market for debt in which domestic lenders lent for budgets that were approved by a parliamentary process, so that, in effect, the creditors were represented in the parliament. And at a stroke, with that, the cost of debt was reduced dramatically. Now, in the second half of the 20th century, in Europe, in many other countries, most debt was domestically held. But one of the attractions in the 1990s of moving into the monetary union and you asked us, Mr. Chairman, whether we considered what there might have been in the way of mistakes, was that it was possible to borrow more and more from foreigners. So a foreign debt market developed. And with that, I think there is a constant temptation, which becomes very acute in moments of crisis, to say, enough is enough, we can't do any more, we've done enough, this is the end, you should pay for your irresponsibility in lending to us. So is there a lesson from this deep history of the 17th and early 18th century, from the British Revolution in finance, that you could learn for the European circumstances? There is, I think, and it really does concern the link between debt and democracy, debt and democratic legitimacy, in that if you want to Europeanize debt, you also need to think of mechanisms in which the creditors are going to be represented in parliamentary institutions and vote on budgets, and think about the mechanisms through which there can be a long-term and stability-giving framework for the accumulation of debt. Without that, there will be, in crisis times, I believe, this constant temptation, the constant wish from the point of view of the debtors and the constant fear from the point of view of the creditors that the creditors will be expropriated in a dramatic moment of crisis. Let me also finally think of one area where it seems to me that we really also need to learn from the crisis. The story of European integration in its most recent phase goes back to the 1950s, and the Treaty of Rome has been mentioned a great deal. But there were really two waves of European integration. One in the 50s and 60s that then ran out of steam in the 1970s and early 80s, and then another that got underway in the late 80s and early 1990s. And they were very different in character. And again, this is an answer to the question, what kinds of mistakes were made? The second wave of integration was really very heavily driven by a sense of a functionalist logic, that once you got going with one bit of the process, the developments in the next bit would follow automatically. So you didn't really need to fix everything at the time of Maastricht, and there were big emissions there. There was a big discussion, for instance, at the time of Maastricht, should there be a common European banking supervision and regulation? But it didn't take place. There were powerful national interests that were against it. The elaboration of the fiscal rules took a long time and was, as the previous speakers have pointed out, really unsatisfactory. But there was always the belief that it didn't matter if you didn't get a complete package, because sometime in the future, the bits of the package would emerge almost automatically in response to some kind of crisis situation. But this is a mechanism that actually, if you think about it, has crises built into it. And it's very different from the vision that was elaborated in the 1950s, where there was a much more general and much more adequate and politically viable option for building progressively European integration. At the very moving ceremony for the retirement of Jean-Claude Trichet, there was a great speech by Helmut Kohl, the wrong Helmut, by Helmut Schmidt. Helmut Schmidt, the really great German chancellor from the 1970s. And Schmidt looked back very much at this first generation of makers of Europe at Konrad Adenauer, Robert Schuman, Alcide de Gasperi, but also went on to extend that. He said he also wanted to think of the people who had the vision of Europe, including Winston Churchill in 1946 in the Zurich speech, or Václav Havel, or Lech Wałęsa. I think actually he also should have added John Paul II, who had a really tremendous vision, not just of Poland, but of Europe and the world as a community of responsibility. These were people who had a far-sighted view, that didn't focus on the kind of functionalist logic of just doing bits of a framework and then assuming that somehow the rest will fall into place. So when we think of what we need to do now, we really need to pay as much attention to the elaboration of that longer-term vision and to recover some of that spirit from the 1950s as we do to pay attention to the short-term fixes that were the focus of the financial press over the last week. So my appeal would be, if we learn the lesson of this crisis, to look at the long term and to think of what the logic of, say, a debt mechanism is that involves really a deep sense of legitimacy about what our obligations to the future, what the obligations of the future are to us. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. And now the speaker is... The applause means that we need professors from academia to enlighten us. Prime Minister Ruud Lubbers, you have the floor.
Thank you, sir. The choice for this date was in one way or another a bit related to 1991 Maastricht. Indeed, I was chairing that meeting, so I take that as a point of reference in time. In the 90s, however, maybe the most important phenomenon was not the Treaty of Maastricht. It was something that was not visible in the beginning, but happened in the financial markets. I labeled them with the financial innovations. This was the intelligence of smart people to understand that you could reorganize the financial systems by decoupling the link between the creditor and the debtor. So that has led to securitization, but not only that. I will not fatigue you with all these terms. Somewhere in the middle of the 90s, I remember, people started to say, hey, but is this responsible? And there were even people who introduced the term, this is casino capitalism. No, said the innovators, not at all. On the contrary, up till now, we, the financial sector, were surfacing the real economy, but we go one step further. We are going to add wealth to the world by these clever initiatives. And then they had to talk at some point with the regulators. Those days, it was not any longer IMF, but it was Basel I. So they sat down in Basel I, and they convinced those who were in charge, don't worry, this is a fantastic innovation. And if you have worries, don't regulate, because the market will do the job. We'll find out ourselves what are failures or what are good things. We organize ourselves, set of regulation by the market. And this was the way it went. So this grew enormously, changed the world. Package of financial innovations, as I said, by some labeled as casino capitalism, as by others as an enormous new possibility to create wealth. So it went on. Now we saw later in 2007, there were not just critical questions, question marks, but there was the disaster of banks coming down. I refer, of course, to Lehman Brothers, but this is just an example. And then it reached the governments very much, of course, not in a theoretical way about regulations, but in a very real way. What are you going to do? So they had to spend substantial money on that taxpayers' money to try to get out of this. What was considered as a short crisis. And indeed, after that, we have seen an impressive effort, intellectual effort, by the Financial Stability Board to come forward with proposals, recommendations to reduce the risk. Went a bit different in America, where Volcker was able to convince Obama of a certain approach. This was not convincing in Europe, I would say. So there it went more in the direction of increasing the buffers, the reserve ratios in the banks. So to reduce the risks which were related to the financial innovations. Now we are heading to Cannes, the G20 meeting. There was on the agenda in the beginning to draw final conclusions from all this. I fear that the people there are a bit talking about other things. It is still very important. When I take stock of that development, I said it was much more important in the world than was said. It was indeed vital. And we see improvements, but there's still a number of things to be done. To be done, as far as I'm concerned, much more by accepting a role not only from Basel, but also from the IMF again. Because during this decade, we have seen also a degradation of the role of IMF and a belief that we organized things via Basel I, Basel II, we have now Basel III. Nothing wrong with that. Hardworking people all the time, always a little bit too little and too late, you must confess. But anyhow, there is a mechanism, the Basel mechanism. I think time has come to put it very strong to understand that the world economy has fundamentally changed. Indeed, there was this success of what we call these days the BRICS countries, mainly. BRICS countries. This is not longer something strange happening that is underdeveloped countries prove to be able to go for enormous economic growth. It has a real impact in the whole economy. So time has come to restructure the IMF itself. So that's the votes, the voting system. How to handle, how to use the IMF. To give you another example, it's fairly well known that in those BRICS countries there is a big sympathy not to go longer with the tradition of the British pound and then the dollar and then probably the euro and so on. It's nonsense. You need a basket, we call this the special drawing rights. The technique is known for decades, but we can use that method much more, and that could be give a political leverage also for this, let's call them new countries, the BRICS countries, to play a role in the IMF, not only in terms of the votes, but also in terms of their savings. Much more can be achieved to do that. So this is reviewing of the IMF. This would be key. Financial Stability Board. The next step is new IMF to do this. So this is my first key point. My second point is, because of the misery out of the unlimited financial innovations, the countries, and the banks in particular, have to repair, so that is increasing their reserves, their buffers. By definition, this is deflationary. It is limiting growth for a while. It's needed. You have to do it. So what we need very much at the same time, given the situation where we are in, is to find positive signals to boost economic growth. Always the same. There comes my point. There is a possibility. If we look into the report of the OECD, Paris, the first half of this year, a voluminous report, a little bit too voluminous, but the message is clear: greening economic growth, greening the economy. For a long time, this was understood as something what reduced economic growth, greening the economy. Let me assure you, it's on the contrary. It's an enormous potential of new technologies, practicing them, coming to new investments. That is what we need. Green growth is on the agenda, so the restructuring of the IMF and the green growth. You can see to what extent you want to relate to this other Bretton Woods institution, the World Bank, renovating that for green growth. Let's be more specific. What is green growth? Green growth is improving quality of life, but it's also reducing CO2 emissions, a CO2 poor economy. So what does it mean for me as an economist? That the matured economies, in the first place the USO countries, America, Europe, Japan included, have to price CO2. This is totally according to Kyoto, climate change. Common but differentiated responsibilities. Where is the differentiation? The differentiation is you have to start to price CO2 in the matured economies. It's as simple as that. If you do that, and it has started to happen in Europe, in America, in Japan, one has to be a little bit more bold doing that. It's not bringing the economy down, it's creating new initiatives in that direction, greening the economy. I'm not inventing that. Read the report of the OECD, you'll see it there. So this is not something of the outside world. It's many people here are OECD people. So let's take ourselves serious. So renovate the IMF, go for greening the economy. That might be very needed, given the effects of the financial crisis, the financial disorder. They are interrelated, these two things. Having said all this, I go a little bit back to my Europe, Euroland. I am an euro country. Here are a few remarks. When we went for a single currency in Maastricht, we really fought about a single currency. We were not able to agree on the whole mechanism in Maastricht because there was this tendency of a number of member countries, and particularly France, and even Germany to a certain extent, were scared to draw the consequences of the single currency. So let's see later how we are going to calibrate this. You can even read in the treaty that they were a bit scared to really go for a single currency and one bank by making this a note in the treaty itself, where it was said, no bailout. Oh, I was there. I thought the text. I think this is fine because that disciplines the countries to do the job themselves. You cannot count on the others. No bailout. Fine. And let's be honest. In the first 5-7 years after Maastricht, it worked wonderful. Countries disciplined themselves to meet the convergence criteria. If you look into the statistics of those years, it went well. But then it started to unravel. Discipline was over. When one went for a stability pact, what was in fact a license not to be disciplined. So Then other strange things happened to me. I remember my queen in Maastricht saying, I'm prepared to offer my head, because she was on the coins, for a single currency. 5 years later, Europeans had been so clever to say, oh, we can solve this different. We make euros per country, the coins. One is the European side and the other is the national side. So it went different. Then I sat down before I left as a prime minister about the European Central Bank. Okay, fair enough, this has to be in Frankfurt, but at least take then Wim Duisenberg as a president. Fine, they said. So, now, not immediately, because he had to negotiate all the time for 2 years, 4 years, whatever. But one thing was understood very clearly. This would be a president without authority. And to my regrets, my good friend and former colleague Wim Duisenberg, who was very powerful president of a national bank, became a figure there in Frankfurt. Of course, technically, it was all right, and you had to set up the whole system, and he did well, like Trichet did well later. But what we knew, that financial authorities in the member states in Europe were always the Minister of Finance and the President of the National Bank. Those two figures together had always an authority and a duty, therefore, to look after a good system in those countries. When we introduced the ECB, we didn't do. We decided to give no power to Europe, to the Commission. We see now that it is proposed. Merkel, Sarkozy, with Herman van Rompuy in charge. But this is only after the whole tragedy now in 2011. And then the president of the bank, I said, president of the banks have learned, of course, each national bank president is always very polite people, but they can be very strong too. And if there are questions in a country, it's relevant. What does the president of the national bank say? So it adds to the authority and the financial discipline. We thought this is not needed with the European Central Bank. So let's do its technical work and stay out. We'll do that per country. It didn't happen. So this was, in my opinion, a pity. And that went on and on. So now I'm sitting here as a guest on a conference. So I'm an outsider. I should be polite. But I really hope that the people now in charge will draw consequences of this error and go for a strong governance, partly out of Brussels, partly out of Frankfurt. Now, some people say, maybe, you must be crazy. We agreed that the nations keep their total sovereignty in fiscal affairs, especially when it comes to taxes. Yeah, but I can assure you that in Maastricht, the people around the table, all of them expected we cannot go on with that. Before we really start with the ECB, let's say 5, 6 years later, that we must have solved that. It didn't go that direction. I will give you a very practical example that you understand me better. Even today, if the European Central Bank could get the mandate to emit euro bonds. For what euro bonds? Okay, of course, to finance something. I would say is nothing against that the two authorities, Brussels and Frankfurt together, say to a country, you might make use from euro bonds, which we arrange for you, but we will make strict conditions, partly on your own discipline. What's happening already, of course, now with Greece and Ireland and Portugal, because that is seen as temporarily and not correct, but I think it's quite normal. So you could continue this with the euro bonds. And I go even one step further. I see nothing against the theory, but if in the year 2014, 2015, you have not paid back, we'll increase the value-added tax, which is in each European country today. with 1 or 2% to get the money ourselves back. And then people say, oh, no, 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 this is against Europe. This is against what we agreed upon. You have your own autonomy. This is the democracy there. I would say this is stupid. Integration means also integration, really integration of financial authority. So this is on the, a few lines on the euro. Could speak much more longer. Repeating myself and coming to an end very shortly. The most important point is the financial system in the world. Financial Stability Board did good proposals. It's not enough. Secondly, there we have to go to a renovated IMF in a multipolar world with special drawing rights, with savings available from those countries as well in the old world. Then, because of the stage in we are, there's a reason of too limited growth. So you need additional impetus. My God, not any longer a war to get out of a crisis, but greening the economy. That's my next point. And then finally go to Europe. It will take time, of course, to free ourselves of the taboos of the past, free ourselves of this idea, it's possible to have an euro while the countries don't give a damn on the authority what you need, the financial authority, two authorities, one of Brussels and one out of Frankfurt. So this is my story. Thank you.
Thank you, Prime Minister. And now we ask to take the floor Avinash Persaud, looking at us from a slightly bigger distance. You have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for inviting me here to Warsaw. Mario began with a lament at the worrying rise of nationalism in Europe. And as someone who was born with an Indian origin in Barbados and the Caribbean, of parents from different islands, brought up in Britain and considers himself European, I hope I will be more immune from this rise, this worrisome rise of narrow and petty nationalism. I agree that Europe is today at a critical juncture, but not a fatal one. I agree that given the historical strength of the euro versus other currencies, and the relatively historical low level of long-term interest rates, it would be wrong to characterize this crisis as a euro crisis, in the same way as you would not characterize Japan's crisis as a yen crisis. I agree, too, that part of our problem is that we have perhaps overemphasized the M in EMU and not the E. It is entirely understandable that to achieve a truly massive achievement of the single currency, whether some believe it's right or wrong, whether it lasts as long as many of us hope or not, it was certainly a massive achievement. To achieve that required a single-mindedness, a culture of convergence, a cult of convergence. And in our more sober moments, I think we need to think afresh about what we actually mean about economic integration. Economic growth and economic dynamism comes from differences of conditions, of tastes, differences of cycles, of resources, of skills. And the more we can embrace these differences, the more they are no longer hidden by borders, we will have more economic dynamism and growth. And this was part of the story of economic and monetary union. It is not that we achieve economic integration by bludgeoning our differences, by creating institutions and structures that remove them. It's about embracing them. It's about creating systems that allow our economies to better integrate these differences, not remove them, not bludgeon them out of existence. The chairman wanted us to look at whether we made mistakes in the past, whether we were insufficiently concerned about the need for economic as well as monetary union, whether in the future we have the institutions ready for fiscal union. At the time of the development of EMU, I lived and live in the capital of Euroscepticism. And I can assure you that there was a healthy debate about all the issues that today we worry about. The no bailout clause, the Stability and Growth Pact were not random ideas. They were born of anxieties, of moral hazard, of what would happen if we arrived at a single currency for fiscal discipline. We also worried about the effectiveness of a single interest rate across a large and diverse set of countries. These were issues we did think about, we did grapple with. I think that against our intellectual instincts, we overstated the worry of moral hazard on fiscal policy and understated the problems caused by a single interest rate. Why do I say we overstated the issue of fiscal profligacy? Well, if you look at the history, we did not, with the arrival of the single currency, start off on a new trend of fiscal profligacy. Indeed, if you were to remove for the moment Greece from the picture as an economy that represents, as was said, a minority of the European economy, the problem was not of excessive public debts. It was the buildup of private debts. It was the boom in Spain and Ireland and other countries, which then became converted to public debts in the midst of the financial crisis. And indeed, there was no alternative for them to be converted to public debts. We would have been in a very difficult position if they were not so. And so the essential problem that our recent history suggests is that we did not have enough instruments to deal with these regional booms, as opposed to the fact that our fiscal deficit to GDP ratios or debt to GDP ratios were somehow uncontrolled. That's not to say that those are not issues that we need to address, but in terms of the proximate causes of this crisis, the more compelling causes were the fact that we were left without sufficient instruments to deal with the regional booms. Now, I don't mind tying one hand behind my back and having a single interest rate, because I believe it engenders good disciplines and innovations. I mentioned I was born in the Caribbean. Many countries in the Western Hemisphere have voluntarily adopted the US dollar, another currency. It's not entirely voluntary from the US point of view, but it's voluntary from those countries' point of view. And they accept the disciplines that come with that. And those disciplines are significant, but they do not require fiscal union with the United States. As Charles Goodhart and I and others have argued, that we do need to see perhaps greater flexibility in regulatory policy to deal with regional and national booms. And I think that there is a real danger, and this links back to economic integration. The solution to our problem is not to tie both of our hands behind our backs. It is not to fit into a rigid set of fiscal rules that makes it impossible for economies facing, regions facing different experiences to react in any way whatsoever to those differences. By a set of fiscal rules that stops some fiscal activism and discretion. Indeed, I would argue that the prerequisite, one of the lessons we have learned, is the prerequisite of the single interest rate is that we have diversity of fiscal responses and regulation that deals with inevitable differences that will develop. And so I'm nervous about the press towards common and fiscal union. We need to have fiscal discipline, certainly. But I think we must make sure that we do not tie both hands behind our backs, and that we find mechanisms that allow for countries to respond, countries, regions, sectors to respond to differences that a single interest rate cannot respond to, without in any way arguing that we remove the benefits, substantial benefits of a single interest rate. Let me end by saying that in thinking about the future of Europe, we must think a lot about where the growth will come from and how we establish institutions and mechanisms that support growth as opposed to tie both hands behind our backs and trying to get growth. So, for example, when we think about, we can imagine enormous bailouts of countries and banks that do not lead to any growth. And therefore, we must think very carefully about mechanisms of bailouts that are intrinsically linked to growth. A condition, perhaps, of utilizing our funds will be not just that creditors share the burden, but also that the money is spent not in bailouts of creditors, but in pushing for growth in Europe. We are not going to solve our debt to GDP problems. We're not going to solve our unity to nationalism problems in an environment of spiraling recession. We need to have growth. And if we are going to have burden sharing, we are going to need bank recapitalization, and we talked a lot about that in recent days. But bank recapitalization is a necessary but not sufficient condition for growth. We need to find mechanisms where countries can grow in a fiscally credible way. This is not the moment to talk about those precise instruments and institutions, merely to emphasize the priority that these institutions must be built around the goal, not only of fiscal credibility and sustainability, but of growth. Because if we don't achieve that, then we will indeed be at a fatal juncture. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much for this series of presentations or answers, if you wish. If I was to, well, not to conclude, but to sum up what was said, Mr. Monti said that we are in a critical, not fatal stage. There will be no quick fix, and we need a new treaty. Mrs. Diamantopoulos said that we need more political Europe. I mean, and she spoke about Greek mistakes. Mr. James told us that we need longer-term vision with democratic legitimacy. Mr. Lubers spoke about errors and need for strong government in Brussels and Frankfurt and Eurobonds. And Mr. Persaud told us that it is not so much the indebtedness as the single interest rate which is to blame, and that we can have fiscal discipline without fiscal union. My comment, in practice, we did fail exactly this exam, and we have been leading a beggar your neighbor policy in interconnected economies. run by governments wishing to be re-elected with this short-termist normal political temptation behind. To my three questions, did we make mistakes? The answer is yes. And the construction was incomplete. It was both mistakes of people and mistakes of the system. And then, without further reflection given to that, indication was made that we should run the debt policy at a higher level, which means European, not national. And nobody mentioned that at a European level we can go as crazy as we did on the national level. And no single answer was given to my question about two-class, two-tier Europe. And on the method to go forward, roughly the tone was gradual and incremental. Before opening the floor, let me make some complementary remarks. Economic Monetary Union was born as a political project. It is now a half-failed project, needing repair, and an answer should be also political. We knew that we do install this monetary economic union in a non-optimal zone. So crisis, in a sense, was a no-surprise crisis, because it was possible to foresee it will happen if irresponsible politicians will go beyond what is reasonable. And as we have learned and applauded, the only person responsible in this wake of crisis was Trichet. We have on paper right answers, which means we have to communitarize debt and then to communitarize expenditure. Part of the answer is Eurobonds, and we have to go towards fiscal transfer union, for which there is no political agreement so far. Politics were and are behind the economics. I would, in order to provoke, say that this crisis is a blessing. It's not a catastrophe. It's a blessing. Without this crisis, we would not have had the six-pack. We would not be going beyond the treaty. We would not be installing some elements of macroeconomic discipline on the union level. The problem is that elites and public and mentality are behind the real economy. There is a widely shared feeling that we need an institutional change on the EU level and the transfer of national competencies, for which there is little agreement and support. In transferring the national competencies and running macro-financial, macroeconomic policies to the union level, there are two methods. Sarkozy-Merkel, which is called union method, intergovernmental, which is bound to fail. That's my view. And there's a community method, which is only defended by some and so-called Brussels. The situation at present, going forward or going back, staying where we are, is unsustainable. The danger is that we'll wake up in a two-class Europe or two-tier Europe, and for the moment, no answer to that. In terms of budgets, few notice that if you add up the 1% GDP budget of the Union plus the EFSF plus the leverage EFSF, we are coming to 4.5% of the GDP budget in a wide sense, if you add EU budget plus this rescue fund. What does it mean? That economic integration went so far that budget is not commensurate with it, and with this stage of economic integration, we need a 5-7% budget, including what was called yesterday by the chief of equalization payments, I mean the transfers. And let me add something which I think needs to be tackled. Some headlines were using term morale and morality in reference to the crisis. It has a moral or ethical dimension. It's about ethics in politics and in business. And My feeling is that democratic principles were violated while going into this situation, because you have the fundamental principle of democracy: no taxation without representation. Anybody is against? Nobody. And we are taxing our children who are not represented and unborn. What does it mean? That the debt should not be bigger than what can be serviced by the living generation represented in the parliaments, which mean only adults. And undemocratic and unethical is to borrow or to lend more than you can realistically service. So the real issue, systemic and moral, moral is more than political, is about taxing non-represented. And the question, is there a democratic limit to indebtedness? I mean, what is serviceable? Is this the 60%, the magic 60% of Maastricht? Maybe, but you can roughly, it's feasible to calculate. So these are ethical and political questions and not economic or financial. And then this divide in Europe, who should save whom and at what price and under what conditions? There are two ethical questions. First, how far the solidarity to share the burden is on the shoulders of Germans or whoever in the north, and how ethical is lack of responsibility, or how unethical is to abuse this solidarity by others. And then how to install the democratic brakes to irresponsible politics when politicians want to be re-elected every 4 years, and how to install that at the EU level. We're far from there, because we would need a new treaty which is hardly imaginable. So solution to the present situation must be systemic, long-term, and political. Would be better to have them, I mean, definitive, inverted commas, rather to convince others that it will never again, or in the foreseeable future will not reappear. So we need qualitative federal jump or sequenced transition. Now I open the floor to those who would like to comment, but very briefly. I mean, the maximum speaking time in the Parliament is 2 minutes, so I'll cut it by half, 1 minute. Questions, rather questions and very sharp topical comments than speeches. Yes, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. David Marsh. I wanted to put a question to Anna Diamantopoulou, but I would like to start off with what you said, Mario, about this is not a crisis of the euro as a whole, but of individual parts of it. Because it seems to me as though the euro is a little bit like a school, and therefore I wanted to put the question to you, Minister, as Education Minister. Is the euro indeed not like a school where one particular pupil who may come from a very good family has not done his homework? He may be, there's some problem about the falsification of examination papers, and the pupil cannot keep up with the work. This leads to some unrest at the school, and the school is gradually brought into a sense of crisis. You could, of course, simply carry on against all the very desperate situations that you have mentioned, or the pupil could simply change the school. There are other schools in the neighborhood. This may lead to a redrawing of the timetable for the school. It may lead to some disruption. The pupil may have to take a different route to school every day, but there are other schools in the area, and over time, that new source of education may prove to be very propitious. I just wanted to ask you whether that might be an alternative route. And then the other question, which goes into the area which the chairman said regarding a two-speed Europe. Is this not coming across? Because I can hear myself very well, but nobody else can. Yeah. Yeah. The other, I'll put it further away. That's not good. Yeah. The other, I'm obviously losing my time here. Or is there another microphone, perhaps? The other question is regarding the two-speed Europe. And again, I wanted to ask this in a religious way. A lot is at stake here, and there is a phrase in the gospel, what profit a man if he gain the world yet lose his own soul? Could one not indeed lose the soul of Europe by having a two-speed Europe in the way that the chairman has suggested?
Thank you. I'll collect a series of, but please be concise as much as possible. Please.
Jacob Frankel. My question or comment has to do with terminology. And I wonder whether we did not put ourselves in a bind. The logic of no bailout is very clear. You don't want to provide incentives to do the wrong policies with the notion that somebody will bail you out. The reality is that the rationale for actual bailout, let's speak about Greece for that matter, was not let's save Greece. The rationale for bailing out of AIG was not let's save AIG. It was really let's save the system that may collapse if we do not intervene. Do we want really to have a no bailout of the system? Or do we need to construct a system in which there will be greater robustness and less need potentially to bail out the system, but the system, the leaders of the system must always be ready to save the system. So there is an issue whether we are not prisoners of our own words and therefore tying our hands for the wrong reasons.
Well, does it work? Yes. I was in the middle of the 1997 debate on capital liberalization. I remember the meeting in Hong Kong when there was a lot of debate. Stan Fisher, Manuel Guitian, and others, were debating whether the financial market should be liberalized as quickly as it was liberalized. And I remember there was a time that if you were a student or a professor in India and you want to subscribe to the American Economic Review, it was very difficult to do it because you could not get access to foreign exchange. But then the situation changed, and then trillions of dollars could move every day in seconds. As it was pointed out, the political decisions are always much slower than financial decisions. And now we have created a world where you have this tidal wave of movement of capital. At the same time, we have not been able to create an infrastructure, regulatory or otherwise, that would allow this. So the question is, should we go back to constraining capital movement, or should we work harder to create a system that allows this movement? If you look at it, if you're in a position of a bank now that you could borrow money from the European Central Bank at a low rate of interest, and you can lend to the government of Greece or Italy or otherwise at much higher rate, why shouldn't you do it? It's, the incentive is very, very strong. Who can prevent you? Should somebody prevent you? So we really have to rethink back the fundamental change that we brought in the last 20 years. And I don't think that this fundamental question is not being addressed normally. Thank you.
Thank you. The floor goes to the left. Microphone.
Is it on? Two of the speakers asked for some greater political centralization. There is an appreciation that the crisis was quite largely a political one, but neither of the speakers, in fact none of the speakers, actually indicated exactly what form and kind of political reform and political centralization they would like to advocate. I'd like to hear from all speakers what political change they would now like to see.
Thank you. From the center over there.
My name is Podkaminer. I would like to set my comments in the context of idea that solution to the European problem means, among others, having more Germany. Now, going back in time, in historical time, we have seen Germany defaulting on its huge foreign debt twice within a relatively short time. After the First World War, where Germany defaulted on reparations, and after the Second World War, where instead of servicing its huge debt, Germany was rewarded by Marshall Plan. So that much for morality. The second question, the second issue is also connected with German policy, and I'm not referring to the policy during the crisis, but during 15 years running up to the crisis, also from roughly 1990 till 2007. Now, it was suggested that we can have Europe of two speeds. We should be aware of the fact that Germany, in terms of real performance, is a country with low speed, growing at anemically vis-à-vis the rest of the Europe. So one of the reasons for this is the policy of suppressing domestic demand and wages and to export its problems abroad. So one of the seeds of the problem of the present crisis was in the internal policy of German government. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Further, yes, please, on the right side.
Thank you. Willem van Hasselt, Foreign Affairs, The Hague. An observation for you, Chairman. I think your excellent summing up missed, I think, the interventions, the core of the interventions of Mr. Lubbers and Persaud on the growth matter, the greening side, the innovation side. And that makes me, it gives me an opportunity to mention this about the Commission in the whole crisis. What I missed, that at an early stage of the crisis resolution, the Commission didn't come up with matters like beyond GDP, the Stiglitz report, this greening element in a growth perspective. Of course, we all know why this couldn't happen, but, well, that was my observation.
Thank you. Further questions from the floor? I can't see any. If no, I'll give the floor to the panelists in the reverse order. Mr. Persaud first to comment on the selectively, as he wishes, points raised by the floor. Mr. Persaud.
Thank you, and I will make 3 points. Although I think the first general point to make is that one of our problems is that life is gray and politics is black and white. So yes, you don't, when we say no bailout, we have to temper some of those, some of that thinking, because our priority is to save the system. But what we're trying to do is save the system in a manner that does not create the likelihood that we have to keep on saving the system, and that there are consequences for borrowers and creditors. And I think what that means is that there will be bailouts, but there will not be 100% bailouts. And we need to create institutions that allow us to save the system whilst delivering haircuts to creditors, to reintroduce market discipline where there was insufficient amount. That requires discipline on borrowers too, that there are consequences of having to go to a bailout. And I think that if you were to say no 100% bailouts, that if you had a system which saved the system on condition that people took 50% haircuts and the banks were recapitalized and saved, but as a consequence the state had for the temporary time in which they needed those bailouts, there was state involvement. I think that you will try and get some of that discipline. We can't bail out and have no discipline on borrowers and creditors going forward. And in the same regards to capital flows, that life is gray, it's not black and white, that the days where Indian academics couldn't pay for foreign journals, people look back romantically at some of those days, but a country like India and China and the world economy as a whole have benefited tremendously from a more liberal global trading environment. But there are also excesses. But there are also excesses that we have to deal with, and I would argue that macroprudential rules can be applied greater to perhaps temper the feast and famine of these capital flows, but I wouldn't want to return back to a world of the 1970s. And then finally, to Charles's challenge, I do not believe that we need political change to manage this crisis. And I know in a room full of European idealists that will not be a popular thing to say, but I do believe that we need to continue to evolve our political structures. I think that the evolution we've seen with the European Parliament having, at the time I used to dismiss it, but I think today an evolution of increasing powers at the European parliamentary level may be one avenue, but I do not think that is a necessary condition to get us through to this, from this crisis. The final point on looking beyond GDP, it's interesting that there have been a tremendous number of efforts on looking at human development indices, etc., and none of them have any traction, perhaps because of the sense of subjectivity, even though any of us involved in calculating GDP numbers knows there's tremendous subjectivity in that as well. But I think the European Commission should well investigate that further.
Thank you. And now I would like to ask for comments Prime Minister Lubbers.
I was asked, like my colleagues, to be specific on governance proposals. Let me be very specific. First, Christine Lagarde should immediately after the G20 meeting in Cannes, where they discuss the recommendations of the Financial Stability Board, invite for a special session, which she shares as the IMF lady, to look into the renovation of the IMF. That's point one. What to discuss there, I have indicated earlier here. So I'll be very sure. That's the first. Second, the OECD should, in relation to Rio +20 mid-next year, invite the BRIC countries to see what it really means together to go for green growth, with the adagium common but differentiated responsibilities. This is the second. Thirdly, in Europe, Brussels should get its act together, going for a financial authority, call it the finance minister of Euroland, and secondly, increase the mandate of the president of the European Central Bank so that we have two complementary financial authorities. Full stop.
I'd just like to pick up 2 points. One, the question and the point made by Professor Tanzi about capital liberalization. I think it's tremendously important to see how capital liberalization and the flow of goods and the flow of people actually hang together, because it seems to me that you can get a world in which you stop capital moving, and then there's more pressure on the countries where there are many productive workers to push out goods. They're going to do more on the exchange rate. There's going to be competition on the goods market that will then produce more protectionism, and then the flows of labor. You can see, I think, some of this carrying on in the current crisis. So it seems to me that there's really a package to do with liberalization, but that the point that you made about the supervision of the financial institutions through which these flows are channeled is absolutely crucial in order to ensure the stability of it and to stop the system blowing itself up. The second very important point that Charles Goodhart had, should one be more specific on the institutional design, I think we should have been. Obviously there's a time constraint here, but some kind of move towards a fiscal union seems to me to be important. I think it's a lesson of history that monetary unions without some measure of fiscal union really have a bad time. And very threatened. What would it look like? I think you would need to have some central finance minister with a proportion of the GDP of the Eurozone as a whole. But I think there are many grounds for doing that apart from getting the monetary union to work. For instance, we have in Europe a VAT system that is coordinated but is administered nationally and leads to endless amounts of fraud, that there are quantities of beef, other things moved between countries simply in order to generate VAT rebates. It's a kind of irrationality that really should be stopped, and the Europeanization of that is I think, a way of doing that in the same way as you can see in the United States, a gradual development, but it's a very, very slow one, obviously, from the 1790s towards more of a fiscal union. It really only takes place in the 20th century.
Thank you. Minister Diamantopoulos.
Thank you. There was an interesting and rhetoric question referring to schools, teachers, bad pupils, etc. And the conclusion was very clear. Should Greece leave euro or not? Just to use the rhetoric style of the chairman, I will put the question: in the educational system, if there is a bad student, should we expel him, yes or not? No. Is anybody who disagrees? No. So, it's not a solution to expel a country. And I will give two questions. The first one as a Greek politician, the second one as a Europeanist, because I strongly believe to Europe. As a Greek politician, I represent people. I don't represent numbers. There are many studies during these months. The most recent one is from UBS, 2 days ago. The economic cost of a euro breakup and the consequences. The economic cost for a weak country, like Greece, will be a reduction of 11.5 thousand euros per person in the first year and 4,000 euros per person in the second year. It means that in 1 year, it equates to a range of from 40 to 50% of GDP. It cannot happen in a democracy. The second one, as a European politician, because as I told you, it's my political identity. I strongly believe that Europe is a solution. It is the only solution for our continent. According to this study, and there are many like this, it cannot be a breakup of the Eurozone. It cannot be we cannot expel 1, 2, or 3 countries without a huge problem of the Eurozone or problems in other big countries. The cost to the strongest country could be even 3,000 or 4,000 euros per person in 1 year. So the economic cost for Europe, if we start to break up the Eurozone, will be a huge one. But I don't believe that the economic cost will be the most important one. The political cost will be a huge one, because Europe as a soft power which plays a role in the world, which plays a role in the international economy, will not be anymore in the way we know it. And if we take into account history and philosophical and economic analysis, there cannot be such a huge thing in Europe without unprecedented economic and social unrest. And I think we must be very, very careful and plan our steps one by one, because we handle the life of millions of people.
Thank you. Professor Monti.
Thank you very much. Half David Marsh has been taken care by Anna Diamantopoulou. I will take the second half, which is the only one I was able to listen because I discovered the high technology here. The gospel, what profits a man if he loses his soul, two-speed Europe. Yes, I think that I would be in favor of a two-speed Europe to the extent that it is a trajectory towards convergent outcomes. I would not be in favor of two-speed Europe of the sorts I described earlier, where everybody believes that could be ultra Pareto optimal, but still where everybody believes he's in the first speed, but everybody would end up being rather miserable, because I believe that for the global competitiveness of Europe, we need a rather united Europe, but a united Europe on the basis of a modern market economy, not of corporatism. So I think Europe as a whole needs the 17 and the 10 to come to a good cooperation rather than distancing themselves. Jacob, the terminology. I think a certain country or a certain insurance company or a certain bank are bailed out if and only if he has bailed himself out. If and only if they provide enough of a systemic risk. So I think the justification has always been systemic, but was exposed. Now the effort everywhere for financial institutions through modalities of taxation or regulation, for countries through greater discipline, is to internalize the cost so that the occurrence of systemic risk is minimized. I wanted also to pick up, yes, Charles Goodhart. What form or kind of political centralization? I would say that somebody mentioned the European Parliament. What is already going on there is of huge importance. Indeed, we would not have had the six-pack without the European Parliament, a strong six-pack. And it is to be underlined that there is a Parliament who, at least in this case, has played for more enforcement of discipline, not less. So this is already remarkable. I think that we would not need a treaty change now, as some, particularly in Germany, would like to see, because in my view that would undermine already at the moment when it is announced that a treaty change is sought for, would undermine the credibility in the markets of whatever solution is arrived at on Sunday / Wednesday. Finally, it has been said, looking beyond GDP, the greening of growth and the Stiglitz report, etc. I think at this time of Europe, we certainly need to look beyond GDP, but we need even more to look at least at GDP. That is the problem of growth, and that is done very, very, very little. And here we come to Germany. Yes, I insist that I would be happy to see more Germany in the European construction, but more Germany because of the comparative advantage that Germany has relative to anybody else in Europe in being the country which identifies structurally correct and long-term solutions, the Ordnungspolitik, the principles of the social market economy. And we Europeans have willingly accepted, indeed wanted to take that model on board through the several treaties. The problem is when Germany departs from its long-term structurally correct approach. If I can mention one departure, and here I see that in different words also our chairman is in agreement, that is the way in which to conceive budgetary discipline. At the time of the negotiations for the Maastricht Treaty, Germany wanted to introduce the golden rule, which it had in its constitution, namely no public borrowing if not justified by public investment that would increase GDP in the future. And the moral counterpart to this is when you say not to borrow more than you can realistically service. I think this is exactly the golden rule. So I don't think now every country, because we are all in a herd behavior necessarily, because Germany wants the debt break, so each country, the weaker the country, the earlier, precipitates to introduce the debt break in the constitution, including countries like Italy, where it is already in the constitution since 1948, but has not really been observed. But that is the introduction of a principle of discipline, which is never bad, but of an economically absurd principle of discipline, because this means that the debt break is applied not only to unproductive debt, but to debt in general. So this means cutting out a priori the possibility of sustaining growth with certain public investments. So these are the aspects of German evolution that we should try to moderate. And finally, Germany has this de facto leadership within the EU. I hope, like our chairman, that it will exercise that leadership still under, as much as possible, the community method rather than under the nebulous union method. And above all, I hope that there will be, as it seems to be the case in the last 2 or 3 months, an adequate domestic leadership by the German government on European affairs. For example, in presenting to the electorate in Germany the case of Greece that we have heard about this morning, yes, as a case where not 100% of what was requested of Greece so far has been implemented, but as a very big, perhaps historic success of the euro, because the euro was created to diffuse throughout Europe the culture of stability of Germany, and never had a test been so severe and on the whole so successful in terms of transforming the structure of a country, except that it may be, who knows, short-lived because of impatience as to the time given for the effects. This is a transformation that requires normally a generation. it is attempted in 2 or 3 years. At any rate, from the German point of view, of being surrounded one day by countries more similar to Germany in having accepted the culture of stability, I think this is a huge success.
Thank you. Very quick remarks on the soul of Europe of Mr. Marsh. What we are risking is 2 levels of solidarity and a negative spillover, which would then go into, why not single market? I don't think that this two-speed Europe is unavoidable. The debt crisis might also or would have concerned Latvia, and you remember Latvia case when we were in IMF, President Belka, and if not Orban, also Hungary. It is not a currency crisis. It's a debt management on the public level crisis. So I think we could avoid two-speed Europe, but we have no time to go into the details. On the question about whether we are saving Greece or system, obviously we are saving the system, because the costs of saving Greece plus are less than the cost of the failure of the project. I mean, one could apply this cost of non-Europe philosophy. On the question what kind of political centralization project we have, in detail, I mean, in Brussels there's a detailed project on paper. Supervision and sanctioning by the EU-wide government called European Commission. Looking on the budget, EU-wide budget means national budget plus EU budget as an entity. Commissioner within the Commission responsible for the Eurozone with the rights as the competition commissioner, not subject to the collegial decision. Van Rompuy and Barroso offices merged in 2014. Community method applied and not the intergovernmental at all. Stronger European scrutiny, democratic scrutiny by European Parliament. On Germany, Germany is the biggest beneficiary of the Eurozone and the biggest responsibilities on its shoulders. I don't agree here. Sorry. Disagreeing with Monti is something which I cannot even articulate, but really, I think that the leadership should be in Brussels, not in Berlin. And we should avoid the directoire, which is being born, which is somehow enshrined in the Lisbon Treaty, which is more intergovernmental than we would like to have. And we cannot be hostages of the lender politics and FDP, small coalition partner politics, as we are now. On greening, just one word. Greening is an ambition which we share in the European Parliament, for example, but it is not a solution. Overall, on the first questions, we are leaving this room more enlightened on errors of the past. We are more enlightened, although not definitely and not fully, on the solutions for the future. We leave this room with no answer about two-speed Europe, and it is bad news. And the good news is, as with this crisis, which in a way is a blessing for long-term solutions, outside world will do it, will solve the problem of two-speed Europe for us in a disorderly manner if we do not do it ourselves. Thank you for all the speakers for their presentations, which make us leaving this room more enlightened, if you wish, and to the audience participating, asking questions, making comments, and listening. The session is adjourned. I understand that there is a final word by, do I understand properly, by the boss of the, and the host.
Well, I'd like to say 3 things. Number one, I'd like to, well, I'm delighted with the turnout in this hall today. We were afraid that it will be really difficult for the people to decide whether they would risk listening to a wonderful panel and losing part of one of our last Indian summer weekends this year. I'm sure that nobody will be sorry the way you decided to spend your time here. Thank you very much, Jacek, Mario, Anna, Harold, Ruud, Avinash. You gave us a fantastic intellectual firepower, something to think over for the next days and over. Second thing, next year about this time, we'll be having a very similar event. All of you are already invited. The topic, the precise topic, will be written by events, I think. But it will be somewhere on this west-east axis. We would like to retain this Central and Eastern European component, but not in itself, but in conjunction with discussing the real stuff, which is the problems in the core of Europe. Well, one day will be the core of Europe. The third thing is that when I make such a promise to you that we are going to have a conference like this next year, then I realize that someone has to organize it. Well, so I would like to use this opportunity and thank Paweł Samecki, who is the main organizer of this event. He's one, I'm privileged really to have him as one of my closest colleagues and collaborators. He has a long career in the Polish administration. He served as Deputy Finance Minister. He worked with me. Before, he worked as Deputy to Jacek in the Office of European Integration. Must have been a horrifying but rewarding job. Now, well, some of you might even remember him as Commissioner for Regional Policy in Brussels. He has invented this conference. He has planned this conference, maybe with the big help of Andrzej Sławiński, the director of our Economic Institute. He put up the whole team. He even invented all those, or most of those nice lines that Mario Monti, apparently of mine, that Mario Monti quoted a few times. This were Paweł Samecki's lines. So he is really the father of this conference. I'd like once again to thank him in front of all of you. Thank you very much. And see you next year.